Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell, and after several months of preparation and behind-the-scenes talks, I am very proud to present to you a collaboration for the ages between myself and two other excellent YouTube channels. One of the most important and strange civilizations of the entire Middle Ages. A melting pot where the Muslim Middle East met the Christian West. It's one of the most suggested civilizations I've gotten on this channel, and it is the Outremarins, also known as the people of the Crusader states. Yes, indeed, the Crusader states. I and both of my collaborators have each done our own unique build. We did them in secret and then shared them with each other and had our designs slightly influenced by one another during that period of time. And we've all posted them on our own channels. But for here in this video, my disclaimers and my philosophy, as per usual, are up on screen right now. And if you want to see a comprehensive civilization document with all my sources, check out the description down below. Let's talk about my collaborators. I am working with the fantastic Iron Kaiser Gaming, as well as my good buddy Jimmy James. The three of us have worked together occasionally in the past. Both of them will be linked in the description below. They, again, have their own builds for the Crusader states coming out today, so make sure you go and show them some support, and take a note of how their builds are different from mine. How do they compare and contrast? Which ones do you like more? Because I'll tell you right now, mine's going to be the weirdest, and there's no question about it. So go support them. Links down in the description below and in a pinned comment if I remember. And let us move on to a brief overview of who exactly the Outremarins were. Well, as I mentioned, they were the people of Outremer, or the Crusader states as they were better known. Outremer just means overseas in French, in reference to the Holy Land and the European Christian diaspora living there. Now, I should note, Outremerin is not a word that if you put it into Google, you are likely to find. It is not an ideal demonym, but unfortunately, there isn't really a good word for the people of the Crusader states. But after speaking with a French language speaker, we came to the conclusion that this was probably the best bet. Unless we wanted to use a term like Levantine, which in my opinion is slightly misleading because it would better term the local populace of the Levant rather than the incoming European populace. And this civilization is trying to represent both. So thank you very much to Temudin for helping me out with this little language conundrum. But beyond that, the Crusader states themselves consisted of four different principalities. Edessa and Antioch were founded the year that the First Crusade ended. Jerusalem was taken and the kingdom founded the year after. And then Tripoli was conquered and founded about 10 years later. Each of these major cities held claim over a substantial parcel of land. I should note, while a few battles were necessary in order for the Crusader states to truly stake their claim, a lot of this was done through diplomacy, as well as bribery and a little bit of extortion of the local communities. And it was a lot more peaceful overall than you might have expected. What wasn't peaceful, however, was the taking of Acre, which was, in my opinion, the single most important settlement taken in all of the Crusader states besides Jerusalem itself. This was done in 1104 and provided the Crusaders with a safe harbor, and a very good one at that. Acre also ended up being the very last holdout of the Crusader states when they eventually fell in the late 1200s AD. Now, the Crusader states were, in theory, ruled by Jerusalem, but of course there was a lot of intrigue and politicking and families rising and falling in prominence, and they were populated by a pretty substantial European Christian diaspora who came to the Holy Land both to fight and to farm and to seek their fortunes. Some were even just pilgrims who along the way decided they didn't want to make the trip back home. However, this European Christian diaspora was rarely more than 20% of the population, and even that is a very high estimate. They did, however, make up the majority of the freeman class, who were burghers, freemen who had their own businesses and enterprises and were able to own land outside of war, and sergeants in war. Well-trained, not knightly, but still able to afford their own weapons and be professional soldiers to some degree. But beyond these European Christians, there was a very substantial population of local Christians. Remember, the majority of Syria was Christian during this time, as well as many other Levantine peoples, not to mention the Armenians just up north. And this easily made up more than 50% of the populace of the Crusader states. They often served as levies, though as we will get into later, it was harder to enlist a large number of these local Christians in times of war, even though they made up some contingents, such as the famous Turcopoles, who were absolutely instrumental in the success of the Crusader states. However, we must not forget that there was also a substantial Muslim population in the Crusader states. And they were, with some exceptions of course, largely left to themselves. They were left to self-govern, and if they did not cause trouble, they would not be bothered. In many cases, they weren't even taxed. The Crusader states went out of their way to keep good relations with the leaders of these communities, whether just community authorities or active warlords, because they didn't want their own people to get plundered and raided, especially with parties of vulnerable pilgrims coming through all the time. Easy pickings for quick Arab horsemen. And in some cases, these local Muslim communities even allied with the Christians against other Muslims, such as the Jihad of 1110, which saw local Muslim communities in Syria actively defying holy mandate because they really valued the autonomy given to them by the crusading Christians. So, in summary, the Holy Land was a very mixed bag. Yes, there were some horrible bloody battles. Yes, it is a region that has been soaked in blood for a very long time. But during the time of the Crusader states, it wasn't endless violence and persecution. Though, of course, as we'll get into, they were certainly no strangers to war. Let's move on to a history overview. The Crusader states. It obviously begins at the beginning with the First Crusade. Launched in response to unprecedented Muslim control in the Holy Land. The Byzantines said, please help us. There was a lot of other factors as well, such as Muslim raids in the Mediterranean that had been going on for hundreds of years at this point, and it led to a large Christian coalition coming sweeping in and seeing a shocking amount of success. Now, I should note this is an unbelievably simplified overview of the history of the Crusades. Suffice to say that the Crusader states played instrumental roles in all of these and were pretty much the reasons that Crusades beyond the First were able to be launched. The Crusader states provided a safe base of operations for incoming European forces. So yes, the first three Crusader states founded within a year of the First Crusade, Tripoli almost a decade later. The First Crusade was the high point of European Christian success in the Middle East, and really it would only go downhill from here. I should note that this also saw the formation of the holy orders that we are all very familiar with and are in some cases almost more famous than many other elements of the Crusader states themselves. The Hospitallers were formed in 1113, the Templars in 1120, and though they would both have relatively humble origins, they would go on to play instrumental roles within the Crusader states, influencing local politics and amassing a lot of wealth, though they would not become filthy stinking rich until after the Crusades ended and they fled. But we'll get to that a little bit later. So, First Crusade, it was a great success. Crusader states are entrenched, yippee-ki-yay. However, the first major threat to the Crusader states, or Outremarins, was in the 1140s, as a unified Muslim resurgence started to threaten from the south. Edessa itself, which is one of the northernmost Crusader states, was actually recaptured in the 1180s, well before any of the other Crusader states fell. Over 100 years, in fact, Christendom responds to this resurgence with a second crusade. It was an absolute failure. And Jerusalem falls in 1187. Oh no, there's only two Crusader states left. This is a disaster. Let's launch another crusade. The Third Crusade, in fact. Now, we all know the Third Crusade. We see it in the Saladin campaign. It's talked about constantly in media. We see it in the Barbarossa campaign. We see it in the Edward Longshanks campaign. This crusade is the one most people think about when they think about crusades. All of these European monarchs show up. The goal is to retake Jerusalem, guys. And it failed miserably. Salah ad-Din and the other Muslim commanders were able to deal with the Crusaders, though not without substantial loss of life on both sides. But the other two Crusader states remained strong despite this loss, further entrenching themselves in the area. Fortifications everywhere. It was a tough barnacle to crack for the Muslims, even capitalizing on their recent success. So then the Fourth Crusade comes, 1202. We're going to get Jerusalem this time, guys. And it was an absolute failure. In summary, instead of retaking the Holy Land, the Crusaders permanently hamstrung one of the most important Christian hubs in the world. Great. But Outremer remained strong. Fifth Crusade, 1217. It annoyed Egypt, but it was largely an absolute failure. And then we had some new players join the scene. Who's that on the horizon? Is it more crusades? Yes, indeed, it's the Sixth Crusade in 1227. Then the Barons' Crusade. And these ones were actually kind of successful. Now, I should note that these two crusades didn't have nearly as many battles. They're not nearly as sexy and exciting. But there were some notable clashes and skirmishes, and they also made some brilliant diplomatic maneuvers, capitalizing upon some of the political instability in the Muslim world, especially in Egypt during this period of time. And they actually managed to retake Jerusalem. Yes, 3 Crusader states. Awesome. We're going to capitalize on it from here, guys. But then, of all frickin' people, the Khwarezmians. You know where Khwarezm is? It's nowhere near here. It's up like north of Samarkand. They driven out of their homeland by the Mongols, come meandering into the Middle East, and the local Muslims are like, hey, brothers, there's this beautiful big city over there full of riches. Do you mind sacking it for us? And they did. So Jerusalem gets sacked again, brutally I should add, in 1244 by migrating Khwarezmians fleeing the Mongols. And it just doesn't get better from there. 7th, 8th, 9 Crusades, all absolute miserable failures that accomplish almost nothing. The Crusaders even collaborated with the Mongols, who were starting to make their way into the region in like the mid-1200s AD. And then the disasters really started to compound. Antioch falls in 1268. Tripoli falls in 1289. And lastly, after Jerusalem has been sacked and retaken, all of the major principalities are gone. There's only one last holdout. I mentioned it earlier, Acre. And it finally fell in 1291, with some of the last Crusaders making their way out of the harbor, out to sea, in defeat. But boy, it wasn't easy. Even in their weakened state, the peoples of Outremer were able to put up fierce resistance. Fleeing Crusaders ended up on various Mediterranean islands, such as the Hospitallers, ended up founding the Order of Malta, which still survives to this day, I believe, as the sovereign leadership of that island. And so where are the Outremarins now? They're long gone. But I would argue that they have affected culture, as well as arguably modern geopolitics, more than pretty much any dead civilization to this day. They were lingeringly impactful in a way that you don't see of, for example, the Vandals, who vanished off the face of the earth and we don't really think about them much anymore, unless you're like me. And that is where we will end our analysis of Outremerin history. Let's move on to the flavor, the lovely little aesthetic details that make an Age of Empires civilization special. Their architecture would be a combination of Middle East and Mediterranean. They would have Mediterranean architecture for military buildings, everything in the military panel, and the monastery, and Middle East, everything else. I thought that was kind of a cool touch. They would also have completely unique skins for the stone wall and castle, as well as fortified wall, of course. And their language would be Cohenized French. Dieu te bénisse, ladies and gentlemen. What is Cohenization? Well, it is a fancy word meaning like a patois, when a language is heavily influenced and modified based on a bunch of local influences, and ends up becoming a Creole. So my thought, and this might be like a little too experimental, is to maybe, if this civilization were to be implemented, to work with a conlanger to like lightly create a slightly fictionalized French that had influences from Arabic and German and maybe some Armenian and maybe some Greek and Latin. Just like a little sprinkling, but still kind of recognizably French. I think that would be so sick. I will tell you, on the likeliniometer, this particular idea has like a negative 200 out of 10, but I still think it is so freaking cool. Their wonder would be the Crac des Chevaliers. Obviously, it's one of the most iconic castles of the Crusades, and it's a beautiful freaking building. As for some AI player names, you can take a look on screen right now. I'm not going to go into detail on all of them, but I will remind you that if you want to see all of these in full detail, as well as plenty more about the civilization, take a look at the civilization doc linked in the description down below. Let's talk about campaigns now. I got 3 big ideas for you, as well as a couple of smaller ideas. And let's begin with the obvious one. The First Crusade. It is the high watermark of European Christian influence in the Middle East. I think it would be pretty obvious as the major contender, and very interesting in that there were at least 7 major protagonists of the First Crusade that this campaign could maybe like jump between. Maybe in every scenario you could have a choice of like which of anywhere between like 3 and 7 different factions you wanted to take control of based on which crusader leader you wanted to follow. I think it would be super duper cool. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail about the First Crusade because it's super freaking elaborate, but even though we have seen a little bit of First Crusade stuff in the game already, specifically in the Haute-Vie campaign, I don't see any problem in retelling it. We've retold things before in Age of Empires, and this would be a very different angle showing the many trials and tribulations and ups and downs of this fascinating military engagement. Second one, Godfrey of Bouillon. He was the first king of Jerusalem and also one of the most prominent leaders among the First Crusade. He was largely seen as like the most well-liked and the most pious of the leaders of the First Crusade, and therefore when Jerusalem was taken, it was pretty much given to him. Or rather, it was a toss-up between him and Raymond of Saint-Gilles, I believe. And Godfrey ended up winning the throne, though he rejected the title of king. Instead, he was largely called prince because he didn't want to be seen as a king of the Holy Land, that there's something pretentious about that, and actually called himself the advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, rejecting even the title prince entirely. An interesting guy who fought a lot of very important battles during the First Crusade and carried on to have a lot of influence beyond, especially in helping to establish some of the territory of Outremer, as well as dealing with many of the backstabbings and dramas among other crusaders that followed it as well. I think he would make for a great protagonist if only one First Crusade leader had to be picked. And lastly, I want to talk to you about Peter the Hermit. This fellow was appointed by the Pope to gather devoted from all around Europe and reinforce the First Crusade as it was happening. Now, there's a couple versions of the story. In some, he's like this raving madman who just like drags people along, and in others, he's an extremely charismatic speaker who manages to rally a large force of devoted followers. In reality, it was probably somewhere in between. He gathered an inordinately large force of mostly peasants, but also some other nobles and freemen besides, and made his way from Britain through to Germany, committed a bunch of atrocities against the Jews along the way, then all the way through the Balkans down into Byzantium. There were some other serious disasters out there, and then finally into the Middle East, where they got trashed, in summary. They did manage to reinforce the Crusades to some degree, participate in a couple of battles, but for the most part, Peter the Hermit and his People's Crusade, as it was called, was plagued with problems and largely ended in disaster. But I personally find such stories to be very interesting, and I think even if he's much less conventional than these other two, he would make for a really fascinating Outremarins campaign. Now, I want to go over a couple of other quick possibilities for campaigns. For the first, Baldwin I, another of the prominent members of the First Crusade. It's kind of hard to summarize Baldwin. He was a special guy. He was a rogue, for sure. Definitely a talented commander, but also much more selfish. Maybe not the most selfish among the First Crusade's leaders. There were a couple of real bad apples in there, but he was the screwiest, and definitely very eccentric, definitely very daring, and according to one source I read, his actions almost single-handedly undid all of the successes that the First Crusade accomplished. And to me, that screams campaign protag. I don't know about you. Another, Reynald de Chatillon. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He appears both in the Saladin campaign and the Thoros campaign as primarily an enemy, and for good reason. According to a source I read, the Muslims thought of Reynald as the worst of the worst, the evilest Christian that ever had been seen. And even his fellow crusaders thought very little of Reynald. He was a lord, but mostly fought as a mercenary, and would turn on his crusading brethren just as happily as he gleefully butchered the Muslims. I think that playing as villains is very interesting. I don't know about you guys, and if we wanted to do a villain campaign, I don't think there would be any better option than Reynald, especially because he features in so many existing campaigns already. Would be cool to see his side of the story. Maybe humanize him a little bit, but it would be hard to. He was kind of a bad dude. And lastly, Fulk de Villaret. Now, we haven't talked much about the great knightly orders of the Crusades during this period, but this is where that ends. Fulk was one of the Grand Masters of the Hospitallers, and he was one of the most aggressive and successful Grand Masters they ever had. Not only did he oversee part of their evacuation from the Middle East when Acre at last fell, but he was also the one who led the Hospitallers out into the Mediterranean, overseeing and spearheading their conquest of Rhodes, where they would set up shop for quite some time before moving on to Malta. I know that the Holy Orders are a bit of a fan favorite, and so if we wanted to have a campaign focusing on one of those, I think that having Fulk as the protagonist would be extremely interesting and unique, and would also see this civilization battling other Christians far more than Muslim powers, which would be a nice change of pace. Now, as for official appearances for this civilization, there are a lot of potential ones in currently existing campaigns. Obviously, Saladin. I certainly wouldn't want to make every Crusader civilization this one. That's not the point of this civilization. It's not to say anyone who's a Crusader is Outremarins. But, for example, we see the Hospitallers in the Saladin campaign, and they would be a perfect fit for this civilization. Barbarossa V. Pretty much in the exact same boat. Longshanks 2, the same thing once again. Haute-Vie 4, we even see a good candidate for the Outremarins. And lastly, the new Thoros campaign actually has quite a lot of good candidates for the Outremarins, Reynald de Chatillon being a perfect example. And so, unlike a lot of the civilizations that I talk about, there are actually quite a few good candidates for this civilization in the game right now, which in my opinion is a big point in its favor. Now, let's round out the history section with talking about some of the major themes, underlying threads that I noticed while going through Outremarins history. 1. Militarization, what a surprise. The Crusader states were constantly in a state of semi-war. Yes, that's true. And even though I think that the bloodshed in the region has been overstated in culture, there's no doubt these guys were ready for war. Like I said, there was a very large proportion of elite soldiers because of the burgher sergeant class consisting of European diaspora. And they didn't conscript the locals as much, both because there was still a little bit of animus, even among Christians, between the incoming Europeans and the local Syrians and Armenians. They didn't really trust each other that much, and also there was a language barrier. And as such, it was harder for them to communicate and harder for them to participate in war. But in addition to this strong elite core backed up by some Levantine levies, the Crusades pushed siege warfare to new heights. They adopted a lot of technology from Muslim powers, who had adopted a lot of technology in turn from Central Asian powers, who in turn had adopted a lot of technology from China. And so you could argue that Europe developed its own siege proficiency from China because of the connections made during the Crusades. But that's an oversimplification, of course. And so we see threads with elites and with siege, but also they just built castles everywhere. It was an incredibly fortified region. There were tons of holdouts, tons of fortresses, and that was one of the reasons it was so hard for the Muslims to capitalize on their victories to completely expunge the Crusaders for good. Now, another major theme, pilgrim season. There was an extremely large influx of European tourists between April and October of every single year. There were some settlers, some military support, but mostly they were just pilgrims coming to the Holy Land to pray and gawk at the sites and all of the history and all of the religious importance and significance. Pilgrim season was a massive part of Outremer. Arguably, you could say they are the first society that ever had a tourism-focused economy. Because, man, the amount of money they made during pilgrim season was disgusting. And that's not even talking about the many requests they made to Europe for aid, mostly financial, but also of soldiers at times. Yes, the Crusades themselves were not the responsibility of the Outremarins to orchestrate, but it was almost always them saying, hey guys, we're in trouble. That would be the casus belli for a new crusade to be called for, plus the usual failure of the previous one. And the last major theme I wanted to talk about was religious justifications, but practical aims. We think about the Crusades as being religious war, and to many people it was. Like I said, the Crusaders had many different reasons for going on crusades, but religiosity is not as big of a factor as you might expect from a religious war. Politics and economics were, I would say, the more driving forces of the Crusades. Not only was Muslim control of the Mediterranean seen as one of the biggest needs for a crusade in the very first place, but also the many lords and nobles who went on crusades did so in many cases, not all, but many cases, for largely financial reasons. They wanted to make money. They wanted to embark on ventures. They wanted more land than they could get in Europe. They wanted to show how pious they were so that they could have a better shot at ascending to greater heights. These wars were not purely driven from hate and vengeance, though that was definitely the reason for some. Because remember, if it was entirely based in vitriol, then they wouldn't be making alliances and dealings with Muslim powers, which was very common. Like I said, the most successful crusade since the first was the Sixth Crusade and the Barons' Crusade, both of which were largely diplomatic and consisted of negotiating with the Muslim powers rather than fighting and killing them. So just keep that in the back of your mind. This isn't just a civilization about killing non-believers. Though, again, there's no doubt that that was an angle, especially for certain characters and participants within it. And with that, we come to the end of the history section. Next up, we're going to talk about game mechanics. So if you were only here for the history, please remember to like and subscribe before you leave. But for those of you who, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see what I've done with this civilization, let's go on to game mechanics. But make sure as well to go and check out Iron Kaiser and Jimmy James after you finish this video to see what they did with the Crusader states in their own builds. Let us then proceed to some additions to the tech tree. You guys know me, I love to add things to the tech tree, and this build in particular brings up an interesting question. What the heck do we do with a fortified church? This proposal would of course also extend to the Georgians and Armenians build as they exist currently in game. Now, fortified church, I mean church. These, instead of being a strict upgrade to the monastery that would be built instead of a monastery, are something that you individually upgrade a monastery 2. So you click on the monastery, you click on their unit card, they have a little button, and that one monastery has a build animation overlaid upon it and is upgraded over time into a fortified church for the cost of 75 wood and 100 stone. Meaning that to build one from scratch is 250 wood and 100 stone because you take into account the cost of the original monastery. Now, my proposal is that the fortified church is similar to how it is now, statistically speaking. There's some variations. You can check the document if you want the full scoop. But instead of only shooting when you have garrison inside of it, it would have a tower-like based projectile, as well as more garrison space than it does now. But it would only have 6 range, to contrast with a tower's 8. I think this would immediately make the building a lot more useful, as well as a lot more exciting. Not only can it hold an area like a tower can, but since it has more garrison space, you can still chuck villagers into it to make it absolutely obliterate stuff that gets too close to it, kind of like a town center. Also, in terms of the arrow add calculation, my proposal is that relics would guarantee add +1 arrow, to make it so that garrison relics into a fortified church will make it better at shooting rather than worse. Lastly, my fortified church would benefit from all tower upgrades in terms of HP and damage, as well as archer attack upgrades at the blacksmith for range and damage, plus arrow slits as well. So my fortified church is very much a midline between a monastery and a tower. It doesn't have as much range as a tower and is a good deal more expensive, but it has the monastery benefits and also can shoot way harder if you garrison it up. I think that is a more balanced take on the building myself, but of course, if you like the current fortified church, your mileage may vary. Let's move on to an overview of the Outremarins civilization, an elite and siege civilization. Let's talk about their first bonus, and boy, it's a big one. Pilgrim season comes every 5 to 10 minutes. I should note I have changed it since then. It should say 6 to 10 minutes. What this means is from the beginning of the game, or when you build your first TC on a Nomad map, a little timer would be displayed to you and all other people in the game, counting down from 6 minutes. When that hits 0, a little notification would pop up for you and everyone else. Pilgrim season has arrived! And you would get some free units under your starting town center. The timer would then reset, add +1 minute to a maximum of 10, and it would count down again. Now, what you get from Crusader season would depend on which season it was. The first season would only give you like a single militia or something, like a single sword line unit. But if you go all the way to the 7th season, you'll get a ton of stuff. All of the details on Pilgrim season are available on my civilization document. I don't often say that those documents are essential when you're watching these videos, but in this particular case, Pilgrim season is a rather elaborate mechanic, and I would highly recommend you check that out if you are worried about the balance for this bonus. It's undeniably strong. You get a shitload of free units throughout the game, and once you hit the last season, it just keeps vamping without adding more time. So as the Outremarins player, you are guaranteed free units throughout the entirety of the game, and some of them are very, very impactful. Very strong bonus, no doubt, don't worry. I've tried my best to balance the civilization around this thing. I'll be making some allusions to some of the specific batches you get going forwards, but just know if you want all the details, check out the document. Okay, second bonus. Relics generate 20 stone per minute in addition to gold. Why is this? Well, of course, relics were very important to the Crusaders. There's no doubt about that. But additionally, fortifications were very important to the Crusader states and were built everywhere. Because of that, this bonus will enable you to better fortify your region based on how many relics you attain. I credit Iron Kaiser for this bonus entirely. He came up with it, and I absolutely loved it. Third civilization bonus. Siege weapons move up to 25% faster and heal up to 33% HP per minute while near other military units. What does this mean? Well, for every military unit you have within 2 tiles, besides other siege, up to 5 at maximum, you get incremental advantages from this bonus. So if you have like one random swordsman near your mangonel, it'll move 5% faster and heal 6.6 HP per minute. And it just stacks and stacks and stacks up to the maximum of 25 and 33, depending on how much you have around. This obviously incentivizes you to not only field a lot of siege, but also move them with your units rather than having just a big block of siege and the rest of your army milling about, and really incentivizes a mixed approach to combat, which is a big emphasis I have with this civilization. Siege warfare was obviously very, very important, and some of the sieges during this period could last for a very long time. So I wanted a bonus that made siege more mobile and able to be deployed out across the battlefield, as well as one that gave it a little bit more staying power. Last of the major bonuses, their team bonus. The Mangonel line does plus 33% damage to buildings. This is drawing from much the same grounding as the one I just went over. The amount of siege warfare done during this period of time was enormous. Yes, there were some pitched battles, but overwhelmingly the Crusades were fought with sieges. And as the Europeans discovered and adapted a lot of the technology that the Muslims had got from China through many different connections and series of events, they began to refine it quite effectively, to the point where they were punching through. I think it's a pretty reasonable team bonus and reinforces this civilization's siege identity. Let's move on to their unique units, beginning with the Templar Knight, their castle unique unit. It costs 80 food and 50 gold, and it is a very slow, very tanky cavalry unit. Like the tankiest, slowest cavalry unit in the game. It also has a low rate of fire, so even though its damage is not bad, it's going to not be able to outdamage a knight, or pretty much any other heavy cavalry unit. And it also has a weakness to cavalry archers, which do some bonus damage against it. A reference to how the Crusaders were picked apart by nimble cavalry archer forces, especially in the early days. The Templar Knight, however, is immune to conversion until your opponent researches the atonement technology, and also benefits from both sanctity and fervor. This makes it even tankier, and boosts its speed up from glacial to not terrible for a cavalry, but still distinctly below average. Most notably, though, the Templar Knight can place castles and monasteries which build themselves. This is much slower than a villager, but if they place one near a relic or near a monastery that is holding a relic, that build becomes dramatically faster, like twice as fast as a single villager. Of note, multiple Templar Knights cannot combine this to build one thing super fast. They can place it, but then villagers need to be the ones to jump in to help make it go faster. Of note also, this power is on a cooldown, so you can't have one Templar place down like 10 castles and run away. They have to wait double the base build time of the building with this power before they can use it again. An interesting unit that will obviously be a fantastic frontline with this interesting little fortification utility as a back pocket tool. Because remember, monasteries for this civilization can become fortified churches, making the Templar Knight able to reinforce your borders far more effectively than even the sergeant could. Why is this? The Templars as an organization built a shitload of castles. It was kind of what they were known for. I at one point even debated that when you place the castle, the Templar hopped off his horse to build it, but since the Templar's logo is two guys on the same horse, they would like ride around with two guys, and then one of them would jump off and build, and the other one would keep fighting. I thought it was cool, but I thought it was maybe a little goofy in retrospect. That's their first unique unit. You build it at the castle, a strong cavalry frontline. Second unique unit, the Hospitaller Knight. This is trained at the monastery or fortified church starting in Imperial Age, and it costs 35 food and 75 gold. Quite expensive for an infantry unit. You can think of it as a cross between a halberdier, a Teutonic knight, and a monk. It has a great attack bonus versus cavalry. It is unbelievably tanky, especially to melee damage, and it is actually able to heal. It has pretty good power for an infantry unit. Like I said, it's very beefy with a great anti-cavalry attack. But that heal is actually an AoE. If you target a unit, other units near it will get a little bit of healing benefit as well. On top of that, the Hospitaller can even carry relics. Yes, you can drop them off if you want, but also, while holding a relic, it gains an aura, which gives conversion resistance and reduces incoming mounted unit damage to all units within a pretty decent radius around the Hospitaller. Now, that's a very complicated unit. Why am I doing it that way? Well, first of all, the Hospitallers were a much more defensive order. They were known for housing and carrying relics, as well as providing aid and comfort and healing to those who were in need, hence Hospitallers. The anti-cavalry thing is a little bit more contrived, but this is a rare example of me doing something for the sake of game mechanics, because without the Hospitaller, this civilization would not have a good counter to cavalry. You'll see why in a little bit. So the Hospitaller, besides doing great anti-cavalry damage, having that anti-cavalry aura, I think, gives them a little bit more ability to help counter cavalry in a more dynamic and interesting way than just being a halberdier on steroids. Last unique unit, this one available at the archery range, is the Turcopole. This unit replaces the cavalry archer entirely and costs 40 wood and 40 food. It is substantially weaker than a cavalry archer and has one lower range, making it like dramatically worse at everything that a cavalry archer wants to do. It also doesn't have an attack bonus versus pikemen, but it is quicker to train and also easier to micro because it has a lower firing delay. More notably, it actually has an attack bonus versus archers, and an even bigger one against cavalry archers. Reason being is that the Turcopoles, who were largely light cavalrymen, often fighting with bows and spears in combination, but I decided to just go with the bow side for simplicity's sake, were the Crusaders' ticket at countering the insufferable tactics of the locals when they first started coming into the Holy Land. Their heavily armored, slow-moving armies were eaten up by fast archers and cavalry archers using hit-and-run tactics, and only when they started enlisting Turcopoles, these local Christian levies riding on horses using the same fast tactics, did they find a proper counter. As such, I choose to represent this as a cavalry archer unit with an attack bonus versus archers. Though I should note, they are not resistant to archers and will get chewed up by enemy archer fire, even if they can also chew up those archers themselves in turn. As with all of these units, make sure to take a look at the civilization document down the description for more details on all of these guys in turn. Oh, and I forgot, the Turcopole upgrades in Imperial Age to the Elite Turcopole. That's an important note to make. Before we move on to the tech tree, let's talk about their unique technologies real quick. First one, Fighting March. This was a tactic developed again to help counter the fast mobile archers that were fielded by most Muslim armies during this time. It was kind of testudo-like everyone raises shields, moves very slowly, vulnerable guys in back, that sort of thing. And it was adapted pretty quickly after the First Crusade. And this technology, available in Castle Age, would give your elites and siege units a ranged dodge shield, just like a Shriramsh but this dodge shield, while it is pretty bad, much worse than a Shriramsh rider shield, recharges faster when near friendly elites. This works kind of like the siege weapon bonus, within 2 tiles, something like that. Details on the civilization document. And means that if your army is really nicely clumped and you're fielding elite units, namely units that cost gold, you are going to have very good survivability against incoming archers. Second unique technology available in Imperial Age is Enfeoffing, which allows your docks and castles to serve as universal drop points for your villagers. Enfeoffing was a practice by which a minor noble or local lord or something within a larger Crusader state principality could be enabled to pursue a venture with their land. Kind of like getting the rights to use the land for farming or housing pilgrims, or some other venture besides that. And given that this was often tied to pilgrim season, I felt like this technology was the best way to represent this and also give the civilization a little bit more economic versatility, especially because, as you will see, their economy is pretty garbo. Let's move on to an overview of the tech tree. Letter grade, Spirit of the Law style, beginning with infantry. The Outremarins infantry I give a B. They do have champion as well as the Hospitaller Knight in the monastery, but they lack squires and halberdier, which sucks. They do have a perfect blacksmith, though, which we'll see more of a little bit later. So, pretty okay infantry, not amazing. Archers, it's a B. They have Arbalister, they have the Turcopole, and they even have Parthian tactics for their Turcopoles, but they don't have elite skirmisher, which sucks. And they also don't have thumb ring or hand cannon. So despite their perfect blacksmith and very respectable Arbalesters, I don't really think I can justify giving them any higher. Cavalry, it's a B! What a surprise! Yes, they have the Templar Knight, they have Paladins, and they even have Camels and Steppe Lancers, both of which are representing other elements of Turcopole-style cavalry. But they don't have light cavalry. Joining Teutons as one of the only civilizations without light cav and giving them atrocious trash, as I'm sure you are seeing. They also miss husbandry and the elite upgrades for both of those more interesting regional cavalry units. So their heavy cavalry is quite good. It's fully upgraded, minus husbandry, but everything else is poo. And because of that, I feel like a B is the best overall compromise. Their siege, however, is an A. They have a perfect workshop, minus bombard cannon. Their siege also has fighting march, giving it that much more survivability. Essential in mangonel versus mangonel wars if you are able to pick it up, because even just absorbing a single rock can be the difference between you getting taken out in one crunch and you surviving to shoot back. And on top of all that, you have the team bonus, making your mangonels better against enemy buildings. So while this siege is an A, if we were talking just about the mangonel, it would be an A+ without question. But since all siege benefits from fighting march, and rams in particular are going to get a lot of benefit because the units garrisoned inside count as being close, I think it's going to be a really versatile siege tree, and frankly, we need more siege civilizations in the game, so I'm happy to see it. Defenses, it's also an A. You have Enfeoffing, but you have the Fortified Cursor, we love those. You have the Templar building defenses. You have a near-perfect university, minus Bombard Tower, and you have the Relic bonus giving you more stone. That is a great set of defensive bonuses. I almost called this a defensive civilization. Economy, it is trash. Yes, you get 2 free villagers from Pilgrim Season over the course of 21 minutes. Yay. But you miss crop rotation, gold shaft mining, 2-man saw, guilds, and have no other economy bonus besides stone from your relics. That's really bad. I would argue it's one of the worst economies in the game. Even getting 2 free villagers randomly spaced out over time, I do not think comes anywhere near to compromising it, and their late game will be absolutely atrocious for economy. Yes, and fiefing kind of helps, but the Pilgrim Season speed up is, I think, more important for that bonus. And not having things like guilds is really crappy when you're such a gold-reliant civilization. It just means you have to rely on Pilgrim Season even more, much like the Crusader states themselves did. Your dock, it's a B-. Yeah, you have fiefing, and fiefing is nice, but you miss Cannon Galleon and Shipwright. So overall, it's fine. It's playable. You're not having any good bonuses for your dock will probably make them inviable on water maps, though. Levies. Again, these are my word for trash units. Units that don't cost gold. It's a D. They have some of the worst in the game. I debated a D-. They do have the Turcopole and Elite Turcopole, which are undeniably great. Or maybe not great. Like, they're not going to counter archers quite as hard as skirmishers, but they are going to be more versatile than skirmishers. And Pilgrim Season means that you don't need levies as much, because you will get some powerful elite troops, because Pilgrim Season almost only gives you gold-based military units into the late game. However, you don't have Halberdier, Elite Skirmisher, Light Cav, Guilds, or Conscription. And Conscription missing is the main way I tried to balance them having Pilgrim Season all the way through into the late game. It's way harder for them to mass up an army. They need to wait for Pilgrim Season, especially in the late game, and because of that, their levies are awful. I'm going to say borderline unplayable unless you're just using the Turcopole. Elites, on the other hand, that being units besides Siege that cost gold, is excellent. Fighting March, obviously, is a great bonus for the elites, and they have fully upgraded, besides Thumb Ring and the movement technologies, Champion, Arbalester, Paladin, and unique units. Plus Pilgrim Season giving them even more of those. They don't have the elites for either Camel or Step Lancer, but having the base level of those units in Castle Age can allow for a little more versatility in their mid-game as well. On to their monks, maybe surprisingly, it's a B+. They have the Fortified Church, they have Hospitalers, they have the Relic bonus, they even get a monk or 2 from Pilgrim Season, but they miss Redemption. Now, why did I not give this civilization a monk bonus? Well, like I said, the Crusades were not really a purely religious endeavor, with some exceptions of individual crusaders who were very pious. And so I tried to represent that by giving them very respectable monks, and a good reason to make them for the Relic bonus, but not the sort of monks that are going to dominate the game like Aztecs. Lastly, teams. It's a B-. I would say that their playstyle lends itself well to the layout of teams. They can very easily go heavy cavalry or archers. They're great on pocket because of their powerful armies, great on flank because of their defenses. However, they don't have any explicit team-based bonuses, beyond, of course, the team bonus, and I guess you could say also the Hospitaller having an aura effect. So overall, I'd say their teams are fine, but not pushed enough for me to give them a higher grade. Now, let's talk about their game plan. This section is going to be a little special because I have a special guest to tell you all about the game plan for my build for the Outremarins. Take it away, Kaiser.
Hey, Robbie. Hope you're doing great over there. Going over your Outremer design, you've got a lot of really cool mechanics. I love the idea of Pilgrim Season. It fits the historical inspiration of the Crusader states perfectly. I think they've got a very strong game plan, and perhaps an even stronger early game than you give them credit for. They have a really nice men-at-arms rush by getting a free militia at the 5-minute mark. I know at higher elo levels, some players like using a 2 militia rush. I think it's called a French drush. And this bonus lets you get one of them for free. I actually don't think their archer rush is that great. You're just getting 1 free archer at the 11-minute mark, and the militia won't help too much in an archer versus archer fight. But I think you might be sleeping on the power of their scout rush. Most scout rushes are kicking off at around the 11-minute mark, and at this same time, Outremer is receiving a free archer and 2 militia. That means that you have the counters for spears ready to go. With that archer, you can thwart villagers reinforcing any palisade walls, letting the scouts break in, and the militia will help you lock down areas the scouts have cleared out, like gold mines. I think watchtowers might be the best play against an Outremer player, but if they're building watchtowers, that means they're not able to build extra TCs in the Castle Age without mining stone. and that sets you up nicely for the mid-game. Speaking of the mid-game, I agree that it shines really nicely. You've got amazing siege pushes, you're encouraged to pick up relics because of that stone trickle bonus, and you get access to 3 really cool unique units. I love how the Templar Knight is able to build castles. I didn't really incorporate that into my own design suggestion, but the military orders often took on the role of castle builders and custodians, so it makes perfect sense from that historical angle. Plus, it kind of echoes what sergeants are able to do with the donjons, and they're linked to the Crusades, so that's a fun connection. Now, the good news for Outremarins' enemies is that the Civ is really slow, and their weakness to archer play starts to shine through. Of course, you do have the castle unique tech to help with that, but you've got to get a castle up first to get that bonus. I'd predict that in 1v1s, Outremer players are likely to play heavy feudal pressure into aggressive castle or tower drops, where their slow movement speed is not as important. Now, you have their late game as a C+, and I agree that they start to fall off in some key ways. No conscription hurts, and the lack of good levy options means they're definitely falling behind. On the flip side, at this point of the game, you are getting some powerful gold units for free, including siege units. So that means if the game is going deep into the post-imp phase, you might actually start to turn things back into your favor with those powerful siege options. And if you've played your cards right, between placing castles across the map and collecting most of the relics, I don't think there's much a horde of halberdiers and elite skirms are going to be able to do. Overall, this is a really strong civilization with a bunch of cool options at its disposal. I think they're well set up to take hold of the early game and not let go until they've either won outright or shaped the battlefield in their favor.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Kaiser. You had some excellent insights, and I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about what Kaiser said about this build down in the comments below. Anyways, thanks again to Iron Kaiser. Make sure you go check out his channel for his take on the Outremarins. And let's move on from the game plan for this civilization, now that we've had that great analysis, to some loose threads for the civilization. Questions that I didn't quite answer in my design that I wanted to share with you all. For one, beginning with some uncertainties, Pilgrim Season. It's the flagship mechanic of the entire build. There's a lot going on with it. It's very intricate, and it's probably not balanced. I really believe in this bonus. I think it needs to be a part of the civilization to be faithful to the history, but I'm not going to pretend I got it right the first time, and so I'd be really curious to hear what you guys think. What do you think about the timings on the batches? Kaiser himself already gave me some really good feedback on those, which I have implemented in the build you guys will be seeing here. What units you think should be in those batches, how the batches should spawn in. There's so much to go over, and I'm sure I didn't do it perfectly. So, but for another uncertainty, both of the unique units, the Templar and the Hospitaller specifically, are pretty complex. They have a lot of moving parts. And part of me wonders whether they are too complex. You know me, I don't stray away from complexity. And besides Pilgrim Season, I think a lot of the civilization is relatively straightforward. So I don't mind pushing those 2 units. But if someone said to me, oh, Robbie, there's just too much going on with these, and they gave me like a good way of simplifying them, I'd be very open to hearing it. Now for some tabled ideas that didn't make the build, but I would love to hear your thoughts on. What if Pilgrim Season gave random units rather than like a fixed roster like it has now? What if it included unique units like your own, or maybe the unique units of other crusading European civilizations? I was really tempted to do this. Get some sergeants, get some longbowmen, get some Teutonic knights. That would be so sick. Another idea. What if the Siege Workshop, Mangonel, and Onager upgrade were available an age early each? Maybe even the Workshop and the Onager upgrade were cheaper. That could be really cool. The Cumin Battering Ram bonus is one of my favorite bonuses in the game, but it blows. And so something like this, I think, would be a good deal stronger. But still, I don't think too strong, because Mangonels would be so expensive in Feudal. Maybe you could have Mangonels have like 1 less range in Feudal, so they can't outrange a TC. Lots of ways to do it. I was really close to going with this. What if units, or foot units rather, could garrison in any siege weapon like a ram and gave ram-like bonuses to them? That could be pretty exciting too. That was a way I was thinking about maybe implementing a core siege bonus. Siege engineers could be free or available early. I think Kaiser did something like this in his build. What if the siege tower had a bonus? If any civilization was meant to use the siege tower, it was this one. But unfortunately, it didn't really manifest because I had too many other cool things I wanted to put in. What if the Hospitaller, Relic, aura healed fortifications? I was really close to implementing that. What if you could use the food please, gold please thing on like a cooldown to get free resources, so you're like begging to Europe for more shipments in? I thought that could be cool. What if enfeefing healed units or generated gold rather than speeding Pilgrim Season? The gold one I was actually really considering doing, but I really liked the civilization having garbage economy late game, and giving them a bunch of free gold I didn't think was like congruent with that. A more interesting and nuanced one, Kaiser mentioned he thought their early game might be too strong, and so I proposed, what if instead of missing two-man saw in the late game, they missed double bit axe, but still got bow saw? I think that could be a good way to slow them down, or maybe even miss both double bit axe and two-man saw, something like that. That could help maybe speed bump their early game and make their economy a little worse, so that they can still be focused on like strong early rush play, which I think is really cool and really appropriate for the civilization. I also kind of wanted to give them a better dock and better team play options, because like a lot of the Crusades were fought at sea, and like sea control was very important to them, and also the Crusades could be argued as like one of the biggest team games the world has ever seen. And so I was kind of unhappy with how little focus on teams and dock there was, but there just wasn't room to fit it. At one point I even thought Pilgrim Season could give you ships on water maps, but it just got too complicated. And lastly, projectiles being intercepted by infantry or cavalry, like heavy infantry or heavy cavalry. I thought that could be cool, and it would be another reference to like the fighting march style of tactic. But it ended up being too fussy, and I liked other ideas better. So those are some summaries of the loose threads I had talking about this civilization to myself. I'm pretty happy with how the build came out, even though I certainly don't think it's perfect. But that's all that I have for you all today. Thank you so much for watching, and huge thanks to Iron Kaiser Gaming and Jimmy James. Take a look at them down in the descriptions. They have great channels. I'm sure their builds are fantastic. I saw earlier drafts of both, but not the final products, and I will be eagerly going to watch those as soon as this video goes live. But before we move on to that, let's end off with a look at the likeliniometer. In my opinion, how likely is it that a civilization based on the Crusader states, maybe not called Outremarins, maybe not looking anything like my build here, could feasibly appear in the game someday? And on the likeliniometer for the Outremarins, we have a 3 out of 10. I think it's very unlikely. I think people are sick of Europe, and even though this is a very different style of European civilization, it's a Middle Eastern technically, I think it would kind of anti-scratch the same anti-itch. Even though I think they would have a lot of places in current campaigns, I think people want to see other stories told in the game right now, and so maybe it could appear at some time in future, but I think it would be a long ways in the future. But that's just what I think. Now I want to hear what you guys think. How do you like my build? It's a weird one, I know. How do you like Jimmy's and Kaiser's builds, and how do they compare and contrast against mine? What would you personally have done differently from me, or differently from all of us? Are there any ways that we could have implemented the history differently, or other elements that we missed entirely? There was so much to look at for the Crusader states. That's part of the reason this project took so damn long. There is so much to talk about with the Crusades that it's kind of impossible to fit all of it into one civilization. And lastly, what do you want to see me do next? Are there any other YouTubers you'd like me to collaborate with at some point? If so, leave a comment down below. I would love to hear from you. But until then, my name is Robbie Howell. Big thanks again to Iron Kaiser Gaming and Jimmy James. And ciao for now.